Hi, this is Noah, and I have a dramatic story to share with you. This is from a book on Arthur Fiedler's life. Arthur Fiedler, the conductor of the Boston Pops Orchestra. This is a book written by his daughter. It's full of drama and action, and I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. So the context of this story is early World War I in the United States. So Arthur Fiedler at the time had just switched from violin to viola in the BSO. As World War I intensified, the orchestra was haunted by the conflict. Even before the United States entered the war, the German musicians who made Papa feel so comfortable were looked on less happily by the citizens of Boston. Some members of the audience, sympathetic with the Allied cause, began to feel uneasy at the concerts. So Arthur Fiedler was a German American, by the way, and definitely used his exoticism as a way to gain acceptance, so everyone knew that he was German. Major Higginson, who was the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, who had studied music in Vienna, believed steadfastly in the Germanic orchestral tradition, but he was also a Civil War veteran and deeply patriotic. The ethnic makeup of his orchestra and the explosion of anti-German feeling called for him to perform a balancing act he found increasingly difficult to manage. Higginson, in the Boston Brahmin tradition, truly believed that he knew what was best for the orchestra artistically, unpopular as it might be politically. And this lordly perspective prevented him and the BSO trustees from seeing objectively the public's growing anti-German sentiment. For the first 3 seasons after the war broke out, the dismay about the orchestra's Germanic influences was held at bay by the ensemble's brilliance. But when in 1917 the United States entered the war, the anti-German sentiment became acute, and patriotic gestures gained new significance. So now we're going to see kind of a 1, 2, 3 punch of what happened to them. It's a little bit of a mixture of that classic combination of a mistake or misinterpretation, and then a failure to cover it, and then some mild impropriety. Early in the 1917 to 1918 season, there was an explosive incident. A last-minute request for the orchestra to perform the Star-Spangled Banner at a concert in Providence was turned down by Higginson. The orchestra had not prepared the piece, and Higginson did not wish to embarrass Muck, a German in the land of his country's enemy. Muck was never even consulted about the decision, yet when outrage broke in the press over the orchestra's refusal to play the national anthem, he was the focus of all the blame. A few days later, Higginson was forced to announce that Muck would thereafter include the national anthem on his programs, and he attempted to assume responsibility for the incident. As a result, he too was regarded with suspicion. Muck did not help the situation when he bluntly told the New York Times, "Why will people be so silly? Art is a thing by itself and not related to any particular nation or group. It would be a gross mistake, a violation of artistic taste and principles for an organization such as ours to play patriotic airs." Anti-German outrage spread beyond Boston and across the United States. Operas in German were banned at the Metropolitan Opera. Danish music was banned in San Francisco because it was rumored that the Danes had smuggled supplies to the Germans. The entire country was becoming obsessed. My father, that's Arthur Fiedler now, born and raised in the United States, still seemed very European in Yankee Boston, and he became an object of anti-Teutonic prejudice. People shouted "German spy" at him in the streets. Loaves of bread delivered to him arrived full of holes because vigilant neighbors had poked them to make sure he wasn't receiving enemy messages baked inside. At a seaside bungalow he rented in the summer of 1918, neighbors reported him to the authorities because he had hung Japanese lanterns in his garden. He had indeed hung the lanterns in an attempt to make the dreary little house more festive, but the neighbors were convinced that he was using the lights to signal the German U-boats they were sure were lurking just offshore. The police and the FBI investigated and found no evidence of treachery, but he was made to feel uncomfortable until the war was over. Karl Muck did not get off lightly. Only a few weeks after the national anthem incident, sentiment ran so high against him that the police had to be stationed at the Boston Symphony's concerts in New York. Muck offered to resign, but Higginson refused to accept the gesture, pointing out that the remainder of the season would have to be canceled, denying employment to the American musicians as well as to the Germans. In March of 1918, Karl Muck was arrested in Boston during a rehearsal of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion and interned to a Georgia prison. In June of 1919, he was deported. The actual charges that led up to Muck's arrest involved his indiscreet liaison with a young Boston woman under the age of legal consent. Incriminating letters written by Muck to her had been sent anonymously to the immigration authorities. Although Muck denied anything more than a flirtation, and although his wife steadfastly supported him, for Boston, this was the last straw. He returned to Germany a bitter man, emotionally devastated, and never again returned to the United States, though he received many lucrative offers. Now let's see what happens to Fiedler. These events had a profound effect on my father. He greatly admired Karl Muck and absorbed as many lessons from his downfall as from his years of prominence. Papa developed an almost compulsive discretion and secretiveness about his personal life, especially about any romantic involvements. He also became convinced that an artist should never be perceived to be political in any way. It was evident to him that only danger and disgrace could result from mixing art and politics, and this was a position he strictly maintained for the rest of his life. It is ironic that just as Papa was being suspected of disloyalty because of his German ancestry, he was beginning to feel a firm sense of loyalty to the country of his birth, that is, the United States. He was born in the US and had to go back to Germany. It's a long story. Read the book. When the United States entered the war in 1917, Papa, 22 years old, attempted to enlist in the Navy. Aware that he was too short, he was 5'7", and thin to meet U.S. Navy standards, Papa stuffed himself with bananas and drank gallons of water before going to the enlistment examination. However, he still weighed in at under 120 pounds and was not accepted, much to his disappointment. Then, in 1918, although he had not grown any larger, he was drafted by the Army. He was given time to finish out the 1917 to 1918 BSO season, but then he resigned from the orchestra, gave up his apartment, sold his furniture, and in a move that broke his heart, gave away his dog, Mutzi. Definitely read this book. It is a wild ride.